In the middle of the 20th century, you could drive through almost any American farming state and see them. Blue and gray Ford tractors, pulling plows through Illinois soil, working hayfields in Wisconsin, hauling wagons across Iowa, cultivating corn in Nebraska. The name on the hood was Ford, and Ford wasn't some small farm equipment company trying to survive against John Deere. Ford had helped change what the American tractor was in the first place. In 1917, Ford introduced the Fordson Model F, one of the first mass-produced tractors built on a scale that could make mechanized farming accessible to ordinary farmers. Ford says it ultimately produced more than 4 million tractors between 1917 and 1990. Then came the 8N. More than 500,000 were built. For many American families, a Ford tractor wasn't something they admired at a machinery show. It was the machine that actually worked their farm. And yet, Ford eventually disappeared from the tractor business. Not because farmers stopped needing tractors, not because Ford suddenly forgot how to build them, and not because the Ford tractor was some embarrassing failure. The real story is much stranger. Ford built one of the most recognizable tractor businesses in American history. And then, when the agricultural machinery industry was being torn apart by debt, consolidation, and competition, Ford decided it didn't want to own that business anymore. The blue tractors survived. The name did not. So how did one of America's biggest industrial companies walk away from farming? Before tractors became normal on American farms, most farmers depended on animals for power. Horses pulled the plow, horses pulled the wagon, horses cultivated the crops, and horses had to be fed whether the farm was having a good year or a terrible one. Mechanical power promised something radically different. One machine could work for hours without eating half a field of hay. And Henry Ford understood the potential. Ford's automobile business had already demonstrated what mass production could do to the price of a machine. The next opportunity was agriculture. Ford's answer was the Fordson. Introduced in 1917, the Fordson Model F became one of the defining early mass-produced tractors. Ford's own history describes it as making mechanical power accessible to ordinary farmers, in much the same way the Model T made automobiles accessible to ordinary Americans. Ford wasn't building a tractor for a wealthy landowner with a giant estate. The ambition was much bigger. Build enough of them, make them simple enough, price them low enough, and put mechanical power within reach of the ordinary American farmer. It was the same philosophy Ford had used on the automobile: mass production, standardization, volume. And for a while, the formula worked. The Fordson looked different from the heavy tractors many farmers had seen before. It was relatively light, compact, and most importantly, designed with mass production in mind. Ford was bringing automobile manufacturing logic into agriculture. The effect was enormous. Farmers didn't have to think about the tractor as a specialty machine anymore. It could become another essential part of the farm. By the 1920s, tractors were no longer some strange experiment sitting on the edge of American agriculture. They were becoming the future. But Ford's early tractor story wasn't always smooth. The company eventually withdrew the Fordson from the U.S. market in the 1920s and later re-entered with a new generation of tractors. And the next chapter would produce one of the most important partnerships in Ford tractor history. His name was Harry Ferguson, and what he wanted to solve was a basic problem. A tractor could pull a plow, but controlling that plow properly was difficult. The implement could dig too deeply, ride too shallow, or make the tractor unstable. Ferguson's hydraulic linkage system changed that. The system allowed the tractor to control the implement rather than simply dragging it behind. Ford and Ferguson eventually formed a partnership, and in 1939 the Ford Ferguson 9N entered production. That tractor became the foundation of the famous Ford N Series. Then came the 2N, and eventually, in 1947, the tractor that would become a legend, the Ford 8N. It wasn't enormous. It wasn't the highest horsepower tractor on the market, but that was exactly why it mattered. The 8N was the kind of tractor a relatively small American farmer could actually use. Ford's own historical material describes the 8N as producing about 23 horsepower, using a 4-speed transmission and becoming the company's top-selling tractor of its time, with more than 500,000 produced. And that tells you something important about American agriculture. The industry wasn't built only around giant farms. For decades, millions of American farms operated on a much smaller scale. A tractor around this size could plow, cultivate, pull wagons, run equipment, and replace an enormous amount of animal labor. For the farmer who owned one, horsepower wasn't an abstract number. It was time. It was labor. It was whether the field got planted before the rain. It was whether the hay got finished before the weather changed. And the Ford tractor became part of that daily rhythm. Ford gradually developed a much broader tractor business. The company moved into larger machines, developed diesel tractors, expanded internationally, and in the 1960s and 1970s, Ford's tractor lineup became a familiar sight across American farm country. The famous 2000, 3000, 4000, and 5000 series became part of the Ford tractor identity. And then came the Ford 6000, 7000, and later generations. The tractors became more powerful, the cabs improved, hydraulics improved, transmissions improved, but something else was changing. The American farm was getting bigger, and the economics of farming were becoming increasingly industrial. A tractor wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a massive capital investment. And the companies selling those machines were becoming massive corporations themselves. Ford now had to fight companies that had decades of specialization in farm equipment. John Deere, International Harvester, Case, Massey Ferguson, and increasingly manufacturers from outside the United States. Ford had a famous name. But a famous name doesn't automatically make a successful farm equipment business. For a few years, the future looked fantastic. American farmers were buying equipment. Commodity prices were strong, farm incomes were rising, credit was available. Farmers borrowed money to buy bigger tractors, bigger combines, more land, and more equipment. Manufacturers expanded production to keep up. Ford was part of that boom. But the entire agricultural economy was becoming more dependent on debt. And when the numbers turned, they turned hard. The farm crisis of the early 1980s devastated American agriculture. Interest rates rose dramatically. Land values collapsed. Commodity prices weakened. Farmers who had borrowed heavily during the boom were suddenly trapped. The tractor sitting in the barn might still be perfectly good, but the farmer didn't have the money to replace it. That was a disaster for every tractor manufacturer. And Ford was about to discover that being one of the world's biggest corporations didn't make the agricultural business immune. Here's what makes the Ford story different from companies like Oliver, Minneapolis Moline, or New Idea. Ford didn't depend entirely on tractors. It had cars, trucks, engines, construction equipment, and a global automotive business. So when agriculture became difficult, Ford had other businesses to worry about. That sounds like an advantage, but it also created a different problem. A tractor company requires specialized engineering, specialized factories, specialized dealers, specialized parts, and specialized relationships with farmers. And Ford had to decide how much of its corporate attention should go into a farm equipment industry that had become brutally difficult. The answer, eventually, was consolidation. In 1985, Ford announced that it would buy Sperry's New Holland farm equipment business for $330 million in cash and assume another $110 million in liabilities. New Holland was a major maker of specialty agricultural equipment, including harvesting machinery. The deal made strategic sense. Ford had tractors. New Holland had harvesting equipment. Together, they could offer farmers much more than either business could offer by itself. In 1986, Ford completed the acquisition and combined New Holland with Ford tractor operations. The new company became Ford New Holland. And notice what happened here. Ford didn't abandon agriculture yet. It actually doubled down. It was building a broader agricultural equipment company. Ford tractors remained blue. New Holland harvesting equipment kept its own branding. The combined business operated globally. At the time Ford announced the new subsidiary, its tractor operation employed around 9,000 people, and Ford reported worldwide tractor sales of more than 83,000 units the previous year. On paper, this looked like the future. Ford had combined two major agricultural equipment businesses. But the industry had another problem: scale. The farm equipment industry was becoming a game of giants. Companies were merging. Brands were disappearing. Factories were being consolidated. And the survivors needed enormous amounts of money to keep developing tractors, combines, balers, planters, and every other machine farmers expected. Ford was now competing against companies that were becoming increasingly specialized in agriculture. The question wasn't, can Ford build a good tractor? It clearly could. The question was, does Ford want to keep tying billions of dollars of corporate attention to the farm equipment business? By the end of the decade, the answer was changing. In 1990, Ford decided to sell its farm and construction equipment interests. And in 1991, Ford reached an agreement to sell Ford New Holland to Fiat Geotech. This was the moment Ford's long relationship with tractors effectively changed forever. The business didn't disappear. The factories didn't all suddenly shut down. The machines didn't stop working. Something much more important happened. The Ford ownership disappeared. The new owners had a larger global strategy. Ford products, Fiat products, and other agricultural equipment would increasingly be brought together under the New Holland name. And eventually, the blue Ford tractor, that had been one of the most recognizable machines in American agriculture, became a historical name rather than the identity of a new tractor. But Ford didn't really disappear. Look at a modern New Holland tractor today, and you might not immediately see Ford. The badge is different, the company is different, the engineering organization is different, but the lineage is still there. The Ford tractor business became part of New Holland. And New Holland still talks openly about that lineage. The Basildon tractor plant, for example, was established in 1964 to build Ford tractors. More than 2 million tractors have now been produced there, with Ford's old manufacturing lineage continuing into today's New Holland range. So Ford didn't leave agriculture because tractors stopped working. It left because the business around those tractors changed. That's a much more interesting story. Imagine a farmer in 1950. He isn't running 10,000 acres. He doesn't have a fleet of 500 horsepower tractors. He has a farm, a barn, some livestock, fields that need plowing, a crop that needs cultivating, and an 8N sitting outside. That machine is not transportation. It isn't entertainment. It's the engine of the farm. And when he buys it, he isn't thinking about Ford Motor Company as a global industrial corporation. He's thinking about whether it will start tomorrow morning, whether it can pull the plow, whether he can fix it himself, whether the dealer has the part, whether it will still be working 10 years from now. That's why old Ford tractors developed such a loyal following, because the relationship was never really between the farmer and Ford's corporate headquarters in Detroit. It was between the farmer and the machine. And that's what makes the ending so unusual. Ford built more than 4 million tractors from 1917 through 1990, according to the company's historical materials. Yet Ford tractors are now remembered almost entirely as old machines. That doesn't mean they failed. In many cases, it's the opposite. They succeeded so well that thousands of them survived. The 8N, the 9N, the 2N, the 2000, the 3000, the 4000, the 5000, the 7000. The old blue tractors are still bought and sold, still restored, still used, still sitting behind barns. Some are show tractors, some are working tractors, and some are simply waiting for somebody to turn the key one more time. So let's go back to the original question. Why did Ford stop making tractors under its own name? It wasn't because Ford couldn't make good tractors. It wasn't because farmers suddenly stopped buying machinery. And it wasn't because some other tractor company simply crushed Ford overnight. It was a much bigger shift. American agriculture changed. The farm crisis changed the economics of equipment. The equipment industry consolidated, global competition intensified, and Ford decided that agriculture no longer belonged inside the same corporate strategy as its core automotive business. So Ford bought New Holland, built Ford New Holland, and then sold that business too. The tractors survived, the technology survived, the factories survived, the dealers changed, the ownership changed, and eventually, the name on the hood changed. Today, you can find an old Ford tractor sitting in places the company that built it would barely recognize. A 9N behind an old barn, an 8N at a county fair, a Ford 4000 still pulling a mower, a Ford 5000 working a field. The paint might be faded, the sheet metal might be bent, there might be oil underneath it, but start the engine, and suddenly the history becomes real. Because for a few seconds, you're not looking at an obsolete machine. You're looking at what American farming used to be. A time when one tractor could transform an entire farm. A time when a machine didn't need a computer to be valuable. A time when a farmer could know his tractor almost as well as he knew his own property. Ford eventually walked away from that business. But millions of those tractors didn't. And that's why the Ford tractor story isn't really about a company disappearing. It's about what happens when an industry changes faster than the machines people remember. The Ford name may have disappeared from new tractors, but somewhere in America, an old blue tractor is still running. And as long as somebody keeps one alive, Ford's farming story isn't finished. It just isn't wearing a Ford badge anymore.